Long before Rome became a symbol of power, conquest, and empire, it was a place defined by uncertainty. There were no emperors, no grand monuments, and no sense that this small settlement would one day dominate the ancient world. Early Rome existed on the margins of history, shaped not by ambition, but by necessity. The settlement stood beside the Tiber River, surrounded by low hills that offered limited protection. The land was imperfect and often unforgiving. Floods came suddenly, destroying crops and damaging homes. Summers were hot and dry, draining strength from bodies already worn by labor. Winters brought cold rain and damp air that seeped into walls and bones alike. To live in early Rome was to live close to the earth. The ground beneath one's feet was often uneven and muddy. Paths formed naturally through repeated use rather than careful planning. When rain fell heavily, movement slowed, and daily routines adjusted to the rhythm of the weather. The river shaped everything. Its presence was constant, audible even at night. It provided water, fish, and access to trade, but it also carried danger. When it overflowed, it could undo months of work in a single day. The river gave life, and it demanded respect. Homes were simple and fragile. They were built from wood, clay, straw, and whatever materials could be gathered nearby. Roofs were thatched, walls were thin. Interiors were dark, lit mostly by doorways and small openings that allowed smoke to escape. There was little insulation from heat, cold, or sound. Privacy was almost non-existent. Families lived close together, sharing space, warmth, and responsibility. Smoke from cooking fires filled the air each morning and evening, mixing with the smells of animals, damp soil, and food. Over time, these scents became part of daily life, so familiar they were barely noticed. Rome at this stage was not truly a city. It was a collection of small communities, loosely connected, bound by survival rather than design. There were no paved streets, no monumental buildings, no public spaces meant to impress. Everything was temporary. Everything was practical. A day in early Rome began with light. There were no clocks or bells to mark time. People woke when the sky brightened and rested when darkness returned. Time was measured by the sun, the seasons, and physical exhaustion. Morning meals were modest. Grain porridge, bread if grain was available, perhaps fruit or olives depending on the season. Meat was rare and usually reserved for religious occasions. Food security was never guaranteed. A poor harvest could mean hunger. Floods could wipe out stored supplies. Families learned to stretch what they had, wasting nothing. Work began early and lasted most of the day. Farming was central to Roman life. Fields needed constant attention. Crops had to be planted, weeded, and protected. Animals required daily care. Tools broke and had to be repaired. Fences collapsed and were rebuilt. Everyone contributed. Men, women, and children all worked in ways suited to their strength and age. There was no clear separation between home and labor. Survival depended on cooperation. Children learned early how to help by carrying water, watching animals, and gathering materials. Childhood was brief and closely tied to responsibility. The rhythm of the day was repetitive, but it provided structure. Each completed task offered a small sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. Routine was not boring. It was reassuring. As the day moved toward midday, the pace of life shifted slightly, but never truly slowed. The sun climbed higher, and physical strain increased. Bodies tired quickly under the heat, yet work continued because it had to. Rest was brief and practical, not indulgent. Midday meals, when they happened, were simple and eaten quickly. Food was consumed where one stood or sat, often in the shade of a structure or tree. Eating was about sustaining energy, not pleasure. Water was precious, and its availability shaped daily movement and decisions. Women played a central role in maintaining the household. Their labor was constant and often invisible. They prepared food, cared for children, managed supplies, repaired clothing, and maintained order within the home. Their work did not end with physical exhaustion. It simply shifted from one task to another. Children remained close to adults, absorbing skills through observation long before they were capable of full participation. Play existed, but it was woven into work rather than separate from it. Learning to be useful early reduced the burden on the household and increased chances of survival. As afternoon approached, fatigue became a shared experience. Muscles ached, hands grew raw from repeated motion. Yet there was little room for complaint. Endurance was expected. Hardship was normal. Older members of the community held a quieter but deeply respected place. Age brought vulnerability, but also authority. Elders were living memory. They remembered past floods, past conflicts, and past mistakes. Their knowledge was carried in stories and habits rather than written records. Old age was not romanticized. Illness was common. Death was familiar. Yet elders were not discarded. As long as they could contribute guidance or memory, they remained integrated into the household. As the sun lowered, activity shifted once again. Animals were gathered and secured. Tools were cleaned and stored. Fires were prepared for evening meals. Smoke rose into the air, marking the transition from labor to rest. Evening meals were often the most communal moment of the day. Families gathered when possible. Food was shared carefully. Conversation was subdued, shaped by exhaustion rather than leisure. Stories were told quietly, often repeating familiar lessons. Familiarity was comforting. Darkness changed everything. With no artificial lighting beyond firelight, night brought both rest and vulnerability. Shadows deepened, sounds carried farther, doors were secured. The settlement grew quieter, but never completely silent. Night sounds defined early Roman life. The movement of water, the crackle of fire, distant animals, occasional voices. These sounds were familiar and reassuring, signaling that others were near. Sleep was uneven. Some fell asleep quickly, overtaken by exhaustion. Others rested lightly, alert to unfamiliar noises. Fear at night was quiet, but persistent. A rustle could mean an animal, or something worse. Illness and injury were constant threats. Without advanced medical knowledge, even small wounds could become serious. Healing relied on rest, basic remedies, and luck. Death was not hidden from daily life. Children grew up understanding its presence early. Religion offered structure in an unpredictable world. Early Roman belief was practical rather than philosophical. The gods were not distant ideals, but forces that influenced daily life. Households honored small domestic spirits believed to protect the home and family. Rituals marked daily activities. Before planting, before travel, before conflict. Superstition was not foolishness. It was a way of managing uncertainty when control was limited. Seasons shaped everything. Planting seasons brought urgency. Harvest seasons brought cautious relief. Winter brought scarcity and dependence on stored supplies. Flood season was feared most, capable of undoing months of effort in a single day. Despite hardship, there were moments of quiet satisfaction. A successful harvest, a healthy child, a peaceful night. These moments mattered deeply because they were never guaranteed. Over generations, shared experience created shared identity. Romans came to see themselves as resilient, disciplined, and practical. These traits were not abstract values. They were habits shaped by necessity. No one spoke of destiny. No one imagined empire. Life was focused on the immediate. Another day survived was enough. And yet, slowly and almost invisibly, these ordinary lives laid the foundation for something far greater. Rome was built not in moments of triumph, but in countless quiet days and nights defined by endurance. For the people living them, this was not history. It was simply life. Life in early Rome continued forward, not through grand decisions, but through repetition. Days resembled one another closely, yet no 2 days were ever identical. Weather shifted, tempers changed, accidents happened. Survival required constant attention to small details. Disagreements were inevitable. In close communities, tension accumulated easily. Land boundaries, shared resources, personal disputes, and questions of obligation could all spark conflict. Without complex legal systems, resolution depended on custom, negotiation, and reputation. Those known to be fair were listened to. Those known to be reckless were avoided. Violence was not uncommon, but it was rarely glorified. It was seen as a failure of balance rather than a solution. Most Romans understood that sustained conflict weakened everyone involved. Cooperation, even when strained, was usually the safer choice. Festivals and communal gatherings offered brief relief from daily hardship. These moments were not extravagant. They were simple occasions marked by shared food, ritual observance, and collective memory. For a short time, labor paused and attention shifted toward community rather than survival. Music, when present, was modest. Simple instruments, simple rhythms. The purpose was not performance, but connection. These gatherings reinforced bonds and reminded people that they were not alone in their struggle. Children observed everything. They absorbed not only skills, but attitudes. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned which behaviors were rewarded and which carried risk. Survival knowledge passed quietly, generation to generation. Loss was a constant companion. Illness could take a child quickly. Injury could end a working life abruptly. Grief was acknowledged, but rarely allowed to linger openly. Life demanded continuation. Fields still needed tending, animals still required care. Mourning existed alongside obligation. Burial practices were simple. Death was not hidden from daily life. Children understood early that life was fragile and finite. This awareness shaped a practical outlook rather than despair. Time was valued because it was limited. As years passed, patterns solidified. Certain families gained influence through consistency and reliability. Others fell behind through misfortune or poor judgment. Change was slow, but noticeable over generations. Rome itself grew gradually. New homes appeared, paths widened, activity increased. Yet the core experience of daily life remained grounded in labor, caution, and endurance. Growth did not erase hardship. It reshaped it. People adapted as they always had. They adjusted routines, learned from mistakes, and relied on one another when circumstances demanded it. Flexibility became a quiet strength. At night, when the settlement rested, thoughts often turned inward. People reflected on the day, on what had gone wrong or right, on what tomorrow might demand. These reflections were private, shaped by exhaustion rather than philosophy. Hope existed, but it was restrained. Romans hoped for good weather, healthy animals, and peaceful nights. They did not hope for greatness. Ambition, when present, was modest and practical. Over time, this mindset created resilience. It was not heroic, it was persistent. The strength of early Rome was not found in bold vision, but in the willingness to endure routine hardship without surrender. Generations passed this mindset forward without naming it. Children became adults. Adults became elders. The cycle continued. Rome did not rise suddenly. It accumulated itself slowly, shaped by countless ordinary lives, lived with care and caution. For those who lived within it, early Rome was not a beginning or a destination. It was simply home, a place defined not by what it would become, but by what it required from those who lived there each day. As Rome slowly grew, daily life became more complex. What had once been a loose collection of households began to take on a clearer social structure. People were no longer defined only by family and immediate survival, but by their position within a widening community. This change was gradual and uneven, unfolding over generations rather than years. With growth came pressure. More people meant more competition for land, water, and resources. Fields that once seemed sufficient began to feel crowded. Disputes over boundaries became more common. Questions of ownership, obligation, and authority surfaced with increasing frequency. Not all Romans experienced this change in the same way. Some families benefited from expansion. They controlled better land, accumulated surplus, and gained influence through reliability and connections. Others struggled to keep pace. Debt became a quiet but persistent threat. A poor harvest or illness could trap a family in long-term obligation. These differences marked the early division between social classes. The distinction was not yet rigid, but it was real. Some families carried greater weight in communal decisions. Their voices were heard more readily. Their disputes were resolved more favorably. Power, once diffuse, began to concentrate. Yet Rome did not become orderly overnight. Authority was fragmented. There were no professional administrators or codified laws governing every interaction. Custom and precedent guided behavior. What had worked before was often repeated. What caused conflict was remembered and avoided when possible. This reliance on memory gave elders increased importance. Those who remembered past disputes or agreements were consulted. Their recollections shaped decisions. Knowledge was oral, practical, and closely guarded. As tensions increased, so did the need for coordination. Defense required organization. When neighboring communities threatened Rome's territory, response could no longer be improvised. Men needed to assemble quickly. Supplies had to be gathered. Leadership became necessary, even if temporary. Military obligation expanded alongside social obligation. Every able-bodied man remained a potential soldier. Training was informal but persistent. Skills were learned through repetition rather than instruction. Shield, spear, formation, endurance. Discipline mattered more than strength. Conflict reinforced social bonds, but it also exposed inequalities. Those with better equipment fared better. Those with influence avoided the most dangerous assignments. War did not erase class differences. It highlighted them. Inside the settlement, daily interactions became more regulated. Expectations solidified. Certain behaviors were rewarded. Others were punished socially. Reputation grew increasingly important. Trust was no longer only personal. It was political. Families began to align themselves with others who shared interests. Informal alliances formed. These alliances influenced marriages, labor arrangements, and conflict resolution. Rome was still small, but its social web was tightening. Women continued to hold the household together, but their influence extended beyond the home. Through marriage, kinship, and informal networks, They shaped alliances and preserved stability. Their role was rarely acknowledged publicly, but it was essential privately. Children grew up aware of hierarchy. They observed who commanded respect and who did not. They learned when to speak and when silence was safer. Social awareness became as important as practical skill. Religion adapted alongside society. Rituals grew more formal. Public ceremonies became more frequent. Shared belief helped manage tension by providing common reference points. The gods were invoked not only for protection, but for legitimacy. When disputes escalated beyond personal negotiation, communal judgment was sought. Respected figures mediated. Decisions were enforced through social pressure rather than institutional power. Compliance depended on the desire to remain part of the community. Over time, these practices hardened into expectations. What had once been flexible became customary. Rome was developing a sense of order, though it remained fragile. As population increased, so did exposure to outsiders. Traders, travelers, and neighboring peoples brought new goods and new ideas. Some were welcomed, others were viewed with suspicion. Rome absorbed selectively, adapting what was useful and resisting what felt destabilizing. Trade expanded cautiously. Surplus goods were exchanged. Information traveled alongside objects. Romans learned about other communities, other customs, other forms of organization. Comparison bred both curiosity and caution. Economic activity diversified. Not everyone worked the land. Some specialized in craft, trade, or service. This specialization increased efficiency, but also dependency. A failed exchange could ripple through the community. As daily life grew more interdependent, mistakes carried greater consequences. A broken agreement affected more people. A failed defense threatened more homes. Responsibility expanded with scale. This pressure produced conflict, but also innovation. Romans adjusted their customs to accommodate complexity. Informal rules became clearer. Leadership roles became more defined. Authority began to separate from family alone and attach to function. Public spaces emerged, not as monuments, but as meeting points. Places where disputes were discussed, where decisions were announced, where collective identity was reinforced. Speech became power. Those who could persuade gained influence. Rhetoric was not yet formalized, but communication mattered. The ability to speak clearly, calmly, and convincingly shaped outcomes. With influence came risk. Visible power attracted challenge. Leaders had to balance authority with restraint. Excess provoked resentment. Moderation preserved stability. Life remained difficult. Hunger, disease, and violence did not disappear. But survival increasingly depended on navigation of social systems as much as physical labor. By now, Romans understood that endurance alone was not enough. Cooperation required structure. Structure required compromise. Compromise required trust. This awareness did not produce harmony, but it prevented collapse. Rome bent rather than broke. Conflict was absorbed, redirected, and managed rather than allowed to destroy the community outright. At the individual level, daily life still followed familiar patterns. Work began with light. Meals were modest. Rest was earned through exhaustion. Yet beneath this routine, the social environment had shifted. People thought more carefully about their position, about alliances, about obligation. Identity expanded beyond household to community and role. Over generations, these adjustments accumulated. Rome was no longer merely surviving. It was organizing itself. This organization did not promise comfort. It promised continuity, the ability to endure not just as individuals, but as a collective. For most Romans, this transition was not dramatic. It unfolded quietly, through habit and necessity. Life felt much the same from day to day. But beneath the surface, something durable was forming. Rome was learning how to hold itself together. As this emerging order took shape, everyday life required greater awareness and restraint. Romans learned that actions no longer affected only the household, but could ripple outward into the wider community. Words spoken carelessly could damage alliances. Disputes left unresolved could destabilize entire groups. This awareness encouraged caution. People observed one another closely. Patterns of behavior were noted and remembered. Reliability became a form of currency. Those who kept their word were sought out. Those who did not were quietly excluded. Public disagreement became more structured. Instead of immediate confrontation, issues were increasingly discussed in front of respected figures. These gatherings were informal, but they followed recognizable patterns. Speakers waited their turn. Elders listened. Decisions were weighed rather than imposed. Shame replaced force as the primary means of correction. To be seen as disruptive or selfish carried consequences. Reputation shaped opportunity. Marriage prospects, trade relationships, and communal support all depended on how one was perceived. As expectations solidified, daily interactions became more deliberate. Romans learned when to assert themselves and when to yield. Survival now depended as much on social navigation as on physical labor. Military responsibility continued to influence civilian life. Even in times of relative peace, preparation never stopped. Weapons were maintained. Young men practiced formation and endurance. The threat of conflict lingered constantly at the edge of awareness. Victories brought temporary relief, but they also introduced new challenges. Spoils of war created inequality. Success elevated some families above others. With elevation came resentment. Balance had to be maintained carefully to prevent fracture. Leadership roles became more visible. Certain individuals were called upon repeatedly to organize defense, mediate disputes, or represent the community. These roles were not yet formalized, but they carried weight. Authority emerged through repetition rather than decree. Those who led were expected to show restraint. Excessive ambition was viewed with suspicion. Romans valued stability over dominance. Leadership was tolerated only as long as it served the collective. Women adapted alongside these changes. Through kinship and marriage, they acted as stabilizing forces between families. Information traveled through households quietly. Tensions were often softened before they reached public confrontation. Children growing up in this environment absorbed these lessons instinctively. They learned not only how to work, but how to behave. Social awareness became a survival skill taught without instruction. Religion increasingly reflected communal identity. Rituals emphasized unity and continuity. Public observance reinforced shared values and offered reassurance during uncertainty. The gods were invoked as witnesses to agreements and guardians of order. As Rome's population grew, the limits of memory and custom became apparent. Disputes grew more complex. Oral agreements became harder to track. The need for clearer rules became evident, even if solutions remained imperfect. Trade networks expanded slowly. Goods moved between communities. With trade came exposure to different customs and systems. Romans observed alternatives, adopting what seemed useful while resisting what felt threatening. Economic specialization increased dependency. Farmers relied on craftsmen. Craftsmen relied on traders. Interdependence strengthened the community but also increased vulnerability. Failure in one area could affect many others. Daily life grew more layered. Responsibilities multiplied. Choices carried greater weight. Romans learned to think not only about immediate survival, but about long-term consequence. Despite these changes, hardship remained constant. Hunger still visited. Disease still spread. Violence still erupted. Progress did not eliminate suffering. It reorganized it. Over time, adaptation became habit. What once felt unfamiliar became routine. The community adjusted expectations to meet reality. Flexibility proved more valuable than rigidity. The emerging structure did not promise fairness. It promised endurance. Rome was not becoming gentler. It was becoming resilient. Individuals continued to rise and fall. Families prospered or declined. But the community persisted. Conflict was absorbed, managed, and redirected, rather than allowed to destroy the whole. As generations passed, Romans began to understand themselves differently. They were no longer simply surviving together. They were maintaining something larger than themselves. This understanding did not bring comfort. It brought responsibility. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rome became more than a settlement. It became a system held together by habit, restraint, and collective memory. For those living within it, life still felt ordinary. Work was hard. Rest was brief. Uncertainty remained constant. But beneath the surface of daily routine, Rome was learning how to last. As Rome continued to grow, the balance it had worked so carefully to maintain became increasingly fragile. Systems that had once functioned through habit and shared memory were placed under strain by scale. What had worked for a small community no longer held as firmly for a larger one. Tensions that had once been manageable began to surface more frequently. Disputes became harder to resolve. Decisions took longer. Agreement was more difficult to reach. The community had not changed its nature, but it had outgrown its simplicity. Inequality deepened gradually. Families with land, influence, or military success accumulated advantages over time. Others struggled to keep pace. Debt became a lasting burden rather than a temporary setback. Obligation turned into dependence. These pressures altered daily life in subtle ways. Trust became conditional. Cooperation required negotiation. Survival was no longer only about endurance, but about position. Political awareness grew, even among those who did not seek power. People paid closer attention to who decided what and why. Authority was no longer invisible. It was observed, questioned, and sometimes resisted. Leadership roles hardened. Certain families and individuals came to expect influence. Their presence in decision-making became routine. This familiarity bred both stability and resentment. Power, once tolerated, began to feel permanent. Military success accelerated these changes. Victories brought territory, resources, and prestige. They also brought responsibility and strain. Rome's obligations extended beyond its immediate surroundings. Defense required constant readiness. Expansion demanded coordination. Soldiers returned from conflict changed by experience. Exposure to violence, hierarchy, and reward reshaped expectations. Military service became a path to recognition and leverage. This shifted the social balance further. Daily life reflected these transformations. Farmers found themselves competing with land acquired through conquest. Labor patterns shifted. Wealth circulated unevenly. The sense of shared vulnerability weakened, yet hardship did not disappear. It became unevenly distributed. Some lived more securely. Others felt more exposed than before. This imbalance fueled quiet resentment rather than open revolt. Public life grew louder. Disagreement moved from private spaces into communal ones. Speech became sharper. Persuasion became more strategic. The ability to influence others became as important as physical strength. Institutions began to form, not as abstract concepts, but as responses to necessity. Roles were defined, procedures repeated. Authority attached itself to offices rather than individuals, even if imperfectly. This development brought stability, but also distance. Decisions felt removed from daily labor. Responsibility became layered, accountability blurred. For ordinary Romans, life remained demanding. Work still began with light and ended with exhaustion. Meals remained simple. Illness and injury still threatened. But beneath this familiar routine, the social environment felt less personal. People adapted as they always had. They learned new rules, new expectations, new limits. Flexibility remained a strength, but the cost of error increased. Religion continued to provide structure. Rituals emphasized continuity amid change. The gods were invoked to preserve order, to legitimize authority, and to calm uncertainty. Faith remained practical, focused on stability rather than salvation. Family bonds endured, but they were tested. Economic pressures strained households. Generational expectations shifted. Parents worried not only about survival, but about status and security. Children grew up in a Rome that felt more complex than that of their parents. They learned earlier that success required navigation of systems as well as labor. Social awareness became essential. As years passed, memory of simpler times faded. What once felt like adaptation became tradition. New norms replaced old ones quietly. The community adjusted its sense of what was normal. Rome did not collapse under these pressures. It absorbed them. Conflict was redirected into competition. Resentment was managed through structure. Change became continuous rather than disruptive. Yet this endurance carried a price. The intimacy of early life diminished. Decisions felt more distant. Responsibility spread thin. The settlement that once relied on shared memory now relied on systems. Daily life reflected this shift. People thought more about consequences, about obligation, about alignment. Survival was no longer only physical, it was political. Ambition, once modest, grew bolder. Individuals sought advancement not only through reliability, but through visibility. Success was measured increasingly by influence rather than contribution. This shift did not happen suddenly. It emerged gradually, shaped by opportunity and precedent. Each generation accepted slightly more hierarchy than the last. Despite this, Rome retained its core habits. Discipline, caution, and endurance remained central. These traits, shaped in hardship, continued to guide behavior. The Rome that emerged from this period was no longer merely surviving. It was sustaining itself through structure. This structure was imperfect, strained, and contested, but it functioned. For most Romans, life still felt ordinary. They rose with the sun. They worked until exhaustion. They worried about harvests, illness, and conflict. History did not announce itself, and yet the conditions for transformation were in place. The settlement had become something durable, not because it was gentle or fair, but because it adapted relentlessly. Rome had learned how to endure complexity. This endurance would carry it forward into a new phase of existence, one defined by expansion, contradiction, and power. A phase that would reshape not only Rome, but the world around it. For now, however, Rome remained grounded in the rhythms of daily life. The future was unknowable. The present demanded attention. And so life continued, shaped by habit, restraint, and the quiet weight of change. As these changes settled into daily life, The emotional landscape of Rome shifted as well. People became more aware of uncertainty, not as an occasional threat, but as a permanent condition. The future felt less predictable, shaped by forces beyond individual control. This awareness influenced how Romans planned, worked, and related to one another. Caution became more deliberate. Decisions were weighed carefully. Risk was not avoided entirely, but it was managed. Romans learned to balance opportunity with restraint, understanding that a single misstep could carry lasting consequences. This mindset did not produce optimism, but it produced endurance. Work continued much as it always had, but its meaning subtly changed. Labor was no longer only about survival. It was also about maintaining position within a shifting social order. Success was measured not only in harvests or healthy animals, but in stability and recognition. Farmers watched land ownership change slowly around them. Fields passed from one family to another through debt, marriage, or obligation. These transitions were rarely dramatic, but they accumulated over time, altering the landscape of power and security. Those who lost land often remained, working as laborers rather than owners. Their relationship to the community changed. Dependence replaced autonomy. Pride adjusted to necessity. Life continued, but with fewer choices. Urban activity increased as Rome expanded. More people gathered in shared spaces. Exchange became more frequent. Information moved faster. With this came heightened awareness of difference. Wealth, influence, and ambition became more visible. Public gatherings grew more significant. They were no longer only practical meetings, but arenas of influence. Presence mattered. Silence carried meaning. Who spoke and who listened revealed shifting hierarchies. Speech itself evolved. Language became more careful, more strategic. Words were chosen not only for clarity, but for effect. Persuasion became a skill cultivated deliberately rather than instinctively. This shift affected relationships at every level. Trust was negotiated rather than assumed. Alliances required maintenance. Loyalty became conditional, shaped by circumstance rather than tradition alone. Family life reflected these pressures. Parents prepared children not only for labor, but for complexity. They taught caution, awareness, and adaptability. The goal was no longer simply to endure hardship, but to navigate change without falling behind. Marriage carried greater weight. It was increasingly shaped by social and economic considerations. Unions reinforced alliances, stabilized resources, and extended influence. Personal preference mattered less than security. Women continued to play critical roles in preserving balance. Through households, kinship networks, and quiet mediation, they softened tensions before they erupted publicly. Their influence was subtle but pervasive. Religion adapted once more to meet emotional need. Rituals emphasized continuity in an uncertain world. The gods were asked not only for protection, but for order and stability. Faith offered reassurance when outcomes felt increasingly unpredictable. As memory of earlier simplicity faded, nostalgia emerged quietly. Older Romans recalled a time when life felt more direct, when obligations were clearer, and when community felt smaller. Younger generations accepted complexity as normal, unaware that anything had been lost. This generational shift altered perspective. What once felt like compromise now felt like structure. What once felt like adaptation now felt like tradition. Rome's identity continued to evolve without deliberate intention. Conflict did not disappear. It changed form. Instead of constant physical confrontation, tension manifested through rivalry, influence, and competition for position. Violence remained present, but it was no longer the only means of resolution. Institutions absorbed the pressure by channeling disagreement into process. Rules were imperfect, enforcement inconsistent, but the system endured. Stability mattered more than fairness. Ordinary life continued beneath these developments. People still worried about food, illness, and safety. The rhythms of work and rest persisted. But emotional weight increased. Life required more awareness, more calculation, more patience. Romans adapted as they always had. They learned new habits. They adjusted expectations. They accepted that certainty was no longer possible. Endurance remained central, but it now meant enduring complexity rather than scarcity alone. Survival required attention not only to the physical world, but to the social one. This adaptation did not feel heroic, felt necessary. Most Romans did not see themselves as participants in transformation. They were simply responding to circumstance, one decision at a time. Over time, these responses accumulated. Rome became more structured, more resilient, and more demanding. The simplicity of early life receded, replaced by a system capable of sustaining growth and tension simultaneously. The city that emerged was not yet an empire, but it was no longer fragile. It had learned how to manage pressure without breaking. For those living within it, this was not progress or decline. It was adjustment. Life continued forward, shaped by habit, restraint, and awareness. And so Rome moved steadily into its next phase, carrying with it the weight of everything it had learned through endurance.